Welcome back to FUSTY Stories. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and get ready for another story you won't forget. Let's dive back to the story. Edward Collins was a man of wealth and reputation, known for his sharp instincts in business and his gentle heart in personal life. When he first laid eyes on Victoria Vicky in a London nightclub, he was enchanted. She was unlike any woman he had met. Stunning, magnetic, with a wounded fragility that made him believe she needed saving. Vicky painted herself as an orphan who had endured hardship, explaining that dancing the club was her only way to survive. With tearful sincerity, she promised Edward she was ready to leave that life behind if only he would give her a chance. To Edward, it felt like fate. He saw himself as her rescuer, her protector, and the man who could give her a stable future. Friends and colleagues warned him to tread carefully, but love, or what he thought was love, blinded him. He married her, convinced he was giving her a new beginning. But soon after the wedding, cracks began to show. Vicky's smiles never reached her eyes when Edward spoke about their future. Her interest always returned to the numbers in his accounts, the worth of his properties, the luxury she now commanded. Edward dismissed the doubts gnawing at him, telling himself it was adjustment or nerves. Yet every extravagant demand she made, every careless dismissal of his affection, began to confirm a suspicion he didn't want to face. She hadn't married him for love, but for his fortune. The illusion of love that had once wrapped Edward in warmth slowly began to suffocate him. The man who had once believed in her redemption now felt like a stranger in his own marriage, standing on the edge of a dangerous truth. The unease in Edward's heart grew heavier with each passing month. Vicky had transformed their home into her palace, hosting parties with friends who never acknowledged Edward, laughing too long and too loudly at the compliments of other men. She seemed to live in a world where his presence was optional, but his money was indispensable. At night, when Edward would reach for her, she would feign exhaustion or frustration, leaving him to wrestle with the emptiness of a bed that should have been shared in love. What unsettled him most was her restlessness, the way her eyes lingered on her phone, and how her voice softened whenever she excused herself to take a private call. Edward's instincts as a businessman, those same instincts that saved him countless times in ruthless boardroom battles, were now telling him his own wife was deceiving him. He tried to push the thoughts aside, convincing himself he was being paranoid, but the evidence piled up like stones crushing his chest. Money transfers he hadn't approved appeared on his statements. Jewelry and designer clothes arrived without his knowledge. Vicky dismissed his questions with irritation, as though his concern was an annoyance. Then came the breaking point. One evening, he overheard her whispering to someone on the phone, her voice tinged with excitement he hadn't heard in years. "Just a little longer," she said. "Soon nothing will stand in our way." Edward's blood ran cold. The illusion of love had shattered completely, and all that remained was a dangerous doubt gnawing at his sanity. He realized he was sharing his life with a woman who saw him not as a husband but as an obstacle, and he knew he had to act before it was too late. Edward found himself pacing the halls of his office one evening, mind racing with dread. He needed someone he could trust, someone outside the twisted lies of his marriage. That was when he turned to Dr. Harrison, his longtime physician, and the only man who knew his health better than Edward did himself. Sitting in the sterile quiet of Harrison's private clinic, Edward unburdened his heart. He told him about Vicky's coldness, the suspicious financial activities, and most of all, the chilling phone call he had overheard. Dr. Harrison listened carefully, his brow furrowing as he leaned back in his chair. "If what you're saying is true, Edward, you're in grave danger. This isn't just infidelity. It's betrayal tied to your fortune." Edward felt a strange relief in finally voicing his suspicions, though it didn't dull the sharp ache of betrayal cutting through him. But what Harrison suggested next shocked him. "If you want to know the truth of her heart," he said gravely, "you need to disappear, at least in her eyes. Let her believe she has what she wants, and watch what she does." The suggestion was drastic, even absurd, but the more Edward thought about it, the more sense it made. He couldn't confront Vicky outright. She was too cunning, too rehearsed. He needed undeniable proof of her true intentions. It was there in that sterile clinic that Edward made a decision that would change everything. He would stage an accident, fake a coma, and watch from the shadows as his wife revealed her true colors. For the first time in months, Edward felt a spark of control returning to his life. The plan was set in motion with precision only Edward and Dr. Harrison could manage. One late evening, Edward left his office under the guise of working late. His driver dismissed for the night. On a quiet road near his estate, his car was deliberately crashed into a barricade. With careful orchestration, ensuring no real harm came to him. Ambulances were called, reports filed, and by the time Edward was rolled into the hospital, the story of his accident had already begun to circulate to the world. He was a wealthy businessman who had suffered a devastating crash and slipped into a coma. To Vicky, it was a gift from the heavens. She wept for appearances, her crocodile tears convincing to anyone who didn't know her. But behind closed doors, her joy was almost palpable. As Edward lay in his hospital bed, eyes closed but ears keen, he heard the truth unravel. Vicky rarely visited alone, and when she did, her mask slipped. One afternoon, she leaned over his motionless body and whispered, "Finally, Edward, finally." Her phone buzzed, and she answered it without hesitation. "Richard, love, he's not waking up. Nothing stands in our way now." Edward's heart clenched, but he remained still, playing his part. Each word she spoke confirmed what he had feared all along, that his wife was not only unfaithful, but actively plotting against him. The coma was his prison, but also his window into her deceit. It was a dangerous game, but one he was determined to see through to the bitter end. Vicky wasted no time in inviting Richard Hayes into the fold. Edward lay helplessly as she brought her lover into the hospital room under the guise of a concerned family friend. Richard was smug, his eyes gleaming with victory as he looked upon the man they believed was incapacitated. "He looks so peaceful," Richard sneered softly, squeezing Vicky's hand. Edward felt his blood boil, but his face betrayed nothing. They spoke freely, oblivious to his awareness. After the gala, Vicky whispered, "We'll sell the company. We'll have more than enough to vanish together." Richard kissed her hand in agreement, sealing their conspiracy, while Edward recorded everything with a hidden device Dr. Harrison had arranged. For Edward, the pain wasn't just in their words, but in the cruel intimacy of their actions. Vicky stroked his hand mockingly as she spoke to Richard about their future. They laughed at Edward's expense, joking about his bad luck and how his empire would soon be theirs. Each laugh was a dagger, but Edward bore it, knowing patience was his greatest weapon. He wanted to scream, to leap from the bed and confront them, but he knew the time wasn't right. His plan required precision, and precision required silence. The lovers thought they had won, but Edward was only beginning to tighten the noose. Dr. Harrison's foresight proved invaluable. He had outfitted the hospital room with discreet recording devices that captured every treacherous word Vicky and Richard uttered. For Edward, lying in that bed was a torment unlike any he had known. But with each recording, the evidence mounted. At night, when the hospital was quiet and Vicky had gone, Harrison would slip into the room, transfer the data, and assure Edward that the plan was working. Edward's empire, his reputation, and his dignity were all on the line, but the thought of justice gave him the strength to endure the charade. What troubled him most, however, was the cold calculation of Vicky's betrayal. She didn't simply want him gone. She wanted everything he had built. Her ambition was ruthless, her greed boundless. Listening to her and Richard's scheme about liquidating his assets, selling the company, and fleeing to another country was like listening to vultures tearing his flesh while he was still alive. Yet Edward refused to be their victim. Each recording wasn't just evidence. It was a piece of the rope he would use to bind them. He dreamed of the day he would rise, not as a broken man, but as the execution of their carefully woven lies. Edward knew timing was everything. The annual Thanksgiving Gala was not just a company tradition. It was the event of the year, attended by dignitaries, investors, and media. If there was ever a stage to expose Vicky and Richard, this was it. He envisioned the look on their faces when their own words were played for all to hear. But until then, he had to endure, silently gathering strength and keeping up the illusion of helplessness. Dr. Harrison managed the logistics, ensuring no suspicion fell upon Edward's recovery. The more Vicky boasted about her future, the more Edward sharpened his resolve. Vicky, on the other hand, saw the gala as a final step in her scheme. She spoke openly with Richard about using the event to announce Edward's incapacity, and her intention to assume control of the company before selling it. Her confidence was intoxicating, her arrogance blinding. She strutted around Edward's hospital room like a queen already crowned, never realizing the throne beneath her feet was about to collapse. Edward's heart raced with anticipation. The gala was not just a date on the calendar, it was Judgment Day. As the days ticked toward the gala, Edward's emotions oscillated between fury and despair. He replayed memories of their early days, her tearful promises, her tender words, the illusion that she loved him. How had he been so blind? The humiliation burned deep, not just because she betrayed him, but because he had believed so completely in her lies. Alone in the dark, he wondered if love was ever real or if it had always been a mask she wore to trap him. The thought haunted him, twisting his chest tighter than any physical wound could. Yet, amid the anguish, there was resolve. Edward refused to be broken. The pain she caused would become his fuel, her betrayal his weapon. He envisioned the downfall that awaited her and Richard, the gasps of the crowd, the flashing cameras capturing their disgrace. What once had been a marriage built on illusion was now a battlefield, and Edward was determined to emerge victorious. No matter how much it tore him apart inside, he would play his part until the very end. The Coma was his cage, but it was also his stage. Richard and Vicky grew bolder as the gala approached. They openly discussed travel plans, whispering about exotic destinations, where no one would find them once they liquidated Edward's empire. "We'll be untouchable," Richard bragged, sipping champagne at Vicky's bedside. She giggled, draping herself across his arm, intoxicated by the fantasy of freedom and wealth. Edward listened silently, every word branding itself into his memory like fire. Their overconfidence was staggering. They had no doubt they would succeed. Vicky even began rehearsing her public speech, practicing lines about Edward's legacy and her responsibility to carry it forward. Edward nearly choked on the irony, his wife planning to eulogize him while he was very much alive. They thought him powerless, but they were feeding the fire of his vengeance. The lovers' arrogance blinded them to the truth, that every whispered word, every plotted scheme, was being documented. They weren't just sealing their future. They were writing the script of their downfall. The night before the gala was eerily quiet. Edward lay awake, his heart pounding not with fear, but with anticipation. He knew tomorrow would change everything. Harrison sat beside him, reviewing the evidence one last time. "It's airtight," the doctor assured him. "They'll have no escape once this is played." Edward nodded, though his hands trembled slightly. He wasn't just preparing for justice. He was preparing to confront the woman he had once loved, the woman he had believed in. That thought weighed heavily on him, even as vengeance promised satisfaction. Meanwhile, across town, Vicky and Richard toasted to their impending victory. "Tomorrow we win," Vicky declared, clinking her glass against Richard's. She wore a designer gown she had bought for the occasion, already envisioning herself as the new face of Edward's empire. The lovers indulged in their triumph prematurely, unaware that the storm was gathering, ready to shatter their illusion of control. Tomorrow, the truth would explode, and neither of them would see it coming. For Edward, it was a calm before the storm, a storm he had crafted with precision, and one that would leave his betrayers in ruins. The Thanksgiving Gala was always a grand affair, hosted in the Collins family's stately mansion, a tradition Edward had cherished for years. This time, however, it carried a different weight. Everyone believed the master of the house lay incapacitated in a hospital bed. Vicky arrived in a shimmering gown that clung to her like liquid gold, her smile dazzling as she accepted compliments from investors and dignitaries. "Edward will be proud to see you holding the fort," one elderly partner remarked. Vicky's laughter was sweet, but underneath it was venom, the smugness of a woman who thought she had already won. Richard hovered nearby, masked as a supportive family friend, though his eyes rarely strayed from Vicky's. Together, they looked like predators circling their prey, waiting for the right moment to strike. In the grand hall, waiters carried trays of champagne. The air buzzed with music and conversation, and the media captured every detail of the extravagant evening. Vicky basked in the attention, rehearsing in her mind the speech that would mark the beginning of her reign. Yet amidst the glittering lights and grandeur, a storm was brewing. Behind the scenes, Dr. Harrison and Edward's trusted associates prepared for the dramatic twist that no one, least of all Vicky, could foresee. The gala was not just an event. It was a stage upon which truth and betrayal would collide. When the orchestra paused and the lights dimmed, Vicky took the stage. The crowd hushed, all eyes drawn to her radiant figure. She began her speech with carefully crafted words, feigning grief, yet weaving a narrative that positioned her as the grieving but courageous widow in waiting. "Edward's accident was a tragedy," she said, her voice quivering with manufactured emotion. "But it is now my duty to carry on his legacy, to make decisions for the company he loved, to protect all of you as he would have wanted." Her audience listened with admiration, moved by what they believed was heartfelt devotion. Cameras flashed, recording her every tear and smile. Yet Edward, hidden backstage with Dr. Harrison, listened to every word, his blood boiling. He had once imagined her standing beside him as a partner, but now she was stealing his future with a lie. Vicky's confidence grew as she continued, even hinting at new directions for the company. Edward clenched his fists, resisting the urge to storm the stage prematurely. Patience, he reminded himself. Let her dig her own grave. With each word she uttered, she tightened the noose, and Edward was ready to pull it at the perfect moment. As Vicky finished her speech and applause filled the hall, the giant projector screen behind her flickered to life. At first, the crowd thought it was a tribute to Edward, but then came the unmistakable sound of her voice, secret recordings of her in a hospital room, whispering to Richard. "Richard, love, he's not waking up. Nothing stands in our way now." Her words echoed across the hall. Gasps rippled through the audience, eyes darting between the screen and the woman frozen on stage. Her face drained of color. Her hands trembled as more recordings played, detailing their plans to liquidate the company and flee. The audience erupted into murmurs of shock, anger, and disbelief. Business partners who once admired Vicky now looked at her with disgust. Investors whispered about betrayal. Media cameras zoomed in to capture every ounce of her panic. Richard, seated near the front, stood abruptly, trying to blend into chaos, but it was too late. His voice, too, filled the hall from the recordings. "After the gala, we'll sell everything. We'll be untouchable." There was no denying the truth. Their conspiracy was no longer a secret. It was a spectacle. And then, the moment no one expected arrived. The doors of the grand hall opened, and Edward Collins entered, alive. Walking with firm steps, his eyes cold as steel, he silenced the room without uttering a word. Gasps of disbelief turned into cheers of relief, though many stood frozen in shock. "Ladies and gentlemen," Edward began, his voice steady and commanding, "I thank you for your concern these past weeks. But tonight is not about my return. Tonight is about truth." He turned his gaze toward Vicky, whose knees buckled under the weight of his presence. Vicky's mouth opened, but no words came. Richard tried to slip away, but security blocked the exits. Edward continued, "I trusted this woman with my life, my heart, and my legacy, and she repaid me with betrayal." He gestured to the projector, where their voices still played on a loop. This was the real Victoria Collins, and this is her chosen partner in crime, Richard Hayes. The room erupted with outrage, some shouting, others booing, while flashes from cameras immortalized the moment. Edward had turned his humiliation into triumph, and his enemies were now trapped in their own deceit. Police officers, already briefed and waiting on Edward's instructions, stepped forward as the crowd parted. Vicky shrieked, stumbling backward as handcuffs glinted under the chandeliers. "You can't do this. I'm your wife," she screamed, her voice cracking. But Edward's face was stone, unmoved by her pleas. Richard lunged forward, attempting to resist, but officers pinned him to the ground. "This is a setup," he shouted, but the recordings played above him betrayed his every denial. The crowd watched with wide eyes, the downfall of two conspirators unfolding like a play. Edward didn't flinch as Vicky was dragged past him, her once dazzling gown torn, her face streaked with tears. "You never loved me," she spat, her voice venomous. Edward met her gaze one last time. "No," he replied coldly, "but I believed in you. That was my mistake." Cameras captured every word, and by the end of the night, Headlines would scream of betrayal, scandal, and justice. The predators had been unmasked, and Edward's empire was safe once more. The following morning, the newspapers were ablaze with headlines. Billionaire's wife exposed in gala scandal. Lovers arrested for betrayal. Edward Collins outsmarts conspiracy. The footage from the gala went viral, spreading across social media like wildfire. The public was outraged, not just by Vicky's betrayal, but by the audacity with which she had plotted her husband's downfall. Messages of support flooded Edward's offices, from shareholders to ordinary citizens who admired his resilience and cunning. For Vicky and Richard, however, the world had become a prison even beyond their cells. Their faces were plastered everywhere, their reputations destroyed beyond repair. Once they had dreamed of exotic escapes and endless wealth, now they sat in interrogation rooms, their schemes unraveled. The same arrogance that made them bold now left them broken, mocked by the very world they had hoped to deceive. Though justice had been served, Edward was left with scars no one could see. Nights were long and restless, haunted by the echoes of Vicky's laughter with Richard. He replayed the deception in his mind, asking himself how he had failed to see the truth sooner. Yet even in his darkest moments, he reminded himself that survival was a victory. He had faced betrayal head-on and emerged standing. That, in itself, was strength. At the company, Edward reassumed his role with renewed determination. His employees, once uncertain of their future, now rallied behind him. He assured them the empire will remain intact, stronger than ever, and he poured his energy into rebuilding not just a business but the trust of those who depended on him. Betrayal had nearly cost him everything, but now it became the fire that forged him anew. In prison, Vicky's world crumbled. The woman who once draped herself in diamonds now wore a drab uniform, her beauty stripped of glamour by the harsh fluorescent lights of her cell. She replayed the gala in her mind, the gasps, the stares, the humiliation. Rage consumed her, not at herself but at Edward for outsmarting her. "He'll pay," she whispered into the cold air, though deep inside she knew her game was over. The luxury she craved was gone, replaced by bars and chains. Richard fared no better. The once confident lover now sat in silence, avoiding Vicky's glare. Their passion had evaporated, replaced by blame and bitterness. They had gambled everything and lost. The irony was bitter. While they plotted to imprison Edward in a life without love, they had shackled themselves instead. Edward's personal life was quieter now. He kept to himself, avoiding the empty echoes of his mansion that reminded him of Vicky's presence. Friends urged him to move on, to open his heart again, but trust was a wound still raw. Instead, he found solace in charitable work, pouring resources into shelters and causes for orphans, perhaps an unconscious nod to the story Vicky had once used to ensnare him. This time, however, his generosity was grounded in truth, not illusion. Yet, amidst the pain, Edward found small sparks of hope. Letters from employees, strangers, and even young students arrived, thanking him for standing strong, for showing that betrayal didn't have to define a man's future. Their words were healing, reminding him that though love had failed him, dignity and justice had not. Slowly, Edward began to believe in himself again, not as the man deceived, but as the man who overcame. Months later, Edward stood once more at the podium of the annual shareholders' meeting. This time, there was no Vicky by his side, no shadow of deceit haunting him. Instead, he spoke with clarity and conviction about the future. "We were tested," he told the crowd, "and betrayal tried to tear us apart. But we are stronger because we endured. We are stronger because truth prevailed." Applause filled the hall, genuine and thunderous, a stark contrast to the deceitful gala months before. As he looked out at the sea of faces, Edward felt a weight lift from his shoulders. The chapter of betrayal was closed, and a new one had begun. He had lost a wife, but he had gained wisdom, resilience, and the respect of all who now looked at him not just as a businessman, but as a man who survived the darkest of storms. The illusion of love had died, but in its ashes, Edward found something far more valuable: freedom. And this time, he would never let anyone take it away again. That's the end of the story. What did you learn about the story? Please leave a like and subscribe to our channel for more interesting stories. Thanks for watching.